In this section, I'm going to give you some interesting inputs about the emergence of the term leadership. Now, before we get into the subject of leadership and understand leadership styles and leadership models, I think it is important to understand the emergence of the term leadership. This section will give you some interesting insights about what was the scenario prior to the term leadership coming into existence, and you might get some important learnings from that. You see, the term leadership is actually pretty recent. When I got associated with the industry in the early 90s, at that time, the only term which was more frequently used was management. So people aspired to become managers. Managers were the ones who were in charge, in control, and they were getting the work done. The term leadership was not used very frequently. In fact, even training programs used to be called as MDPs, Management Development Programs. Institutes were management institutes and not leadership development institutes. In fact, before the term manager came into existence, we had terms like foremen or supervisors who were getting the job done. The term manager is also a fairly new term. If you go back into the history of industrialization, you'll realize that prior to maybe 150 or 200 years, the industry was very different than what it looks like today. We did not have mass production. We did not obviously have factories and companies like we have today. Most of the work was done by craftsmen who were experts in their domain. So people like a blacksmith, a goldsmith, a weaver, a potter, a farmer, all of these people were producing in their own ways, and there was no concept of a manager. These were individuals who were experts in their job, and they were single-handedly doing whatever they were doing. The craft used to run in families, so the son of a potter would learn the art from his father and would continue it. Now let's take an example of a man who was involved in making pots as a craftsman. Now there was no manager involved in this whole picture. There was a single person who was completely involved in doing the entire thing from one end to the other end. So let's take the example of a potter, and his job would involve collecting the right kind of soil so that it could be used for making clay, mixing it with the required amount of water so that the clay was of the right consistency, putting it on the potter's wheel to create the earthen pot, then baking it at the right temperature so that it became strong, painting and finishing it if required, and then selling it. And this person would do the entire job himself. There was nobody else involved. Now, the problem was that this person would be able to make lesser number of pots. So, for example, in a day at the most, he could make maybe 5 or 10 pots. However, when the demand increased and when the various modes of transportation were created, there was a greater market available, the demand was more, and now this same potter had a demand of more than 10 pots. The problem was he was not able to make them. And this is where the concept of mass production offered him a solution, that if you want to produce more, you need to get into mass production instead of something called as one-piece flow or single-piece flow. The concept of mass production came into existence. And the only way this could be achieved was, instead of one person doing the job, there needed to be 5 or 6 people who were involved in doing this job. So there was a concept called division of roles and responsibilities. And this meant that one person had to be specialized in doing a particular job. So now, instead of that one potter doing the entire stuff from one end to the other end, you had one guy who was specialized only in collecting the right kind of soil. Another one was specialized in mixing it with water to create the right consistency of clay. to make the pots. The third person was involved in putting that clay onto the potter's wheel and to create the pot with the right size and dimensions and wall thickness. The fourth one was responsible for baking it at the right temperatures in the oven. Okay. And the fifth one was responsible for finishing and cleaning and getting the pots ready for sales. And there could be another one who was involved in storing it and transporting it and selling it. So individuals doing specific jobs. And in this scenario, the potter could make many more pots. So instead of just 5 pots or 10 pots a day, he could probably produce 25 or 30 or 50. Okay. Now, although the production increased, here there was a problem. Because in the earlier scenario, when there was a defective pot, let's say when the potter himself is doing the job alone, if there is a defective pot, then the potter knows. He knows that what has gone wrong and he knows where it needs to be corrected. He takes ownership of that fault and corrects it. But what happens in this new scenario where mass production is used and individuals specialized in specific jobs are doing it? Now, in this scenario, when there's a defect, something called as the blame game starts. Everybody starts pointing fingers at the other person, saying that it's not my fault, somebody else must have done it. So first, the fellow who collects the soil is blamed that the pot broke because the quality of soil was not right. The fellow who collects soil blames the guy who mixes water into it, saying that the clay was not of the right consistency, therefore the pot was defective. And probably they all together blame the one who made the pot, saying that, well, the wall thickness wasn't right and therefore it was weak and therefore broke. Or maybe they blame it to the person who baked the pot, saying that the temperature wasn't right and therefore the pot wasn't strong enough. Or maybe they put the blame to the person who was in charge of transporting it, saying that you didn't do it correctly and therefore it got an impact and broke. Now, if you look at this scenario where the blame game starts, this is where actually came the need of a supervisor or a person who could manage and control this situation. So essentially, there was somebody who was required above all these people who were individuals who were working in specific roles. Someone was required mainly to assign the blame and to identify where was the problem, who was causing it, and to correct it. So if you look at the early days of industrialization, there were people who were supposed to be in charge of the workmen or the labor, and these people were called as the foremen. Okay, or later on, the term that was used was a supervisor. So a foreman or a supervisor, these were people who were in charge of getting the work done. And what was their job? They would not do anything themselves, but their job was to get the work done from labor, from the workmen, from the operators of the machines. And their job was primarily to monitor whether things were done correctly. So they would assign the jobs. So the first thing they would do is obviously identify people who were skilled to do those jobs, assign the jobs to them, ensure that things were done correctly. And if there was something going wrong, then their job was to find out who had to be blamed for the mistake and punish and correct it. They would also be involved in maintaining discipline, maintaining the right, working conditions. And their job was also to ensure that things like wage incentives or the pay for performance, all of those things were taken care of, right? In the initial days of the industrialization, you might know that there was a concept called wage incentives, which Frederick Taylor brought in. So one of the job of these supervisors and so-called, foremen was to ensure that people were monitored for their performance. So you measured how much a person produced so that accordingly that individual could be paid for it. Later on, the term foreman or supervisor got transformed into the term manager. When principles of management emerged, the industry started calling this role as the role of a manager, where the manager had to manage things in order to get the work done. In fact, if you go back into the history of management, I have shared this in another lesson, that the first style to be used was an autocratic style, the style that emerged from the train wreck accident, where they copy pasted the military style, the army style, army hierarchy, and copy pasted it onto organizations. And the first style to be used was the autocratic style. Frederick Taylor and Henry Fayol then came up with the principles of management and scientific management, where they suggested that if you had to get production done, then it could not be done in a haphazard manner. It had to be done in a systematic manner by using certain principles, by using a scientific approach. So Frederick Taylor gave the scientific approach. He gave the principles of wage incentives and how you could get people to perform more. And Henry Fayol came up with the principles of management. And in those days, the principles of management looked something like this. This was the first view of management that Henry Fayol presented. And if you see, there are two words over here, commanding and controlling. And these two words come from the army or military concept of management, which was taken and copy pasted onto industry. That the manager had to command and the manager had to control people. However, if you look at the modern view of management, if you open up any book on principles of management today, you will find that the word commanding has got replaced by the word leading. So there has been a transition in management principles. Later on, Elton Mayo and Abraham Maslow came up with their principles of motivation. You might be aware of the experiments that were done by Elton Mayo at Hawthorne, and that gave a completely new dimension to what we knew about getting productivity and performance from people. And he said that we need to treat individuals like humans, and we need to give them attention. We need to value them, and then they will perform more. And that was actually the time where the human relation concept started emerging. In fact, many of you would be aware that prior to the 80s and 90s, the human resource function itself did not exist formally. It used to be called as the personnel function or a personnel department, where there used to be a personnel and administration manager who used to take care of things like the attendance and the wage incentives, statutory compliances, and salaries and wages to be paid, issues related to labor unions, and all those things. And the human resource aspect came in much later. But all of that started when Elton Mayo proposed that individuals need to be treated like humans. They need to be valued. They need to be given attention and appreciation. And that is what will make them perform better. Abraham Maslow came up with the hierarchy of needs, where he proposed that there are different factors that motivate different people. And one important learning for managers was that what motivates me may not motivate my subordinates. The motivational factors for different people are different. And therefore, we need to understand what exactly are the motivational factors which can be used for improving the performance of an individual. Further to that came the principle of management by objectives. Peter Drucker and his contribution to the industry, where people started understanding that a job of the manager was to help people identify their goals, identify their KRAs, and then help them achieve those KRAs. So that was management by objectives, where the focus was on goal setting, target setting, and then getting them achieved. And around that time, the concept of leadership started emerging, where people started realizing that just being a manager was not good enough. One needed to demonstrate something more than managerial abilities, and that is what was leadership all about. And from that point in time, A lot of study and research has happened about the concept of leadership and the concept of management and what an individual needs to do in order to move from being a manager to being a leader. In this course, we are going to discuss all those interesting concepts and principles of what is leadership all about, how is it different from being a manager, and what does one need to do in order to move from being a manager to being a leader. Hope this input gives you an interesting insight about the history and the background of management and leadership, and hope you are able to derive learning from this in the context of leadership and management today.